Well, I'm Tom Harris. I'm a professor in economics, state extension specialist, and also director of the University Center for Economic Development. This is part of our UCED's COVID-19 information series and webinars. One of the most notable impacts of COVID-19 has been the emergence and importance of broadband. As for me, I had to learn how to teach online in a week. A lot of us at UNR, and Zoom is, if I had 5 years ago, if I ever had a penny stock, it was Zoom, I'd be a millionaire now. And all of us have been teaching, learning how to do work. It's evolving to many things, such as these webinars. It's been important. And today, I have Brian Whitacre from Oklahoma State University. That's where I went to school, got my doctorate, and he'll make a presentation on this. Brian has done a lot of studies on broadband and internet, and its importance to rural life and also for economic development in Oklahoma, but many areas. And as we know, we've been looking at this in the state of Nevada. Brian's topic for the day is what state policies help improve broadband availability. And before I turn it over to Brian, there's just a few words I want to tell everybody. We are recording this, and we'll be sending it out later after we do the ADA compliances. Please mute your microphone while we have this going on. Brian will speak for about 15, 20, whatever minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. I will be monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions, put them in chat, or at the end of when I go through all the chat, there's anybody, I'll open up and ask for questions for Brian. And so Brian is in Greater Stillwater, America, the home of the first place Oklahoma State Cowboys of the Big 12, at least for this week. Next week they play somebody better than my Sisters of the Blind, so we may be in trouble. So Brian, take it away.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thanks for having me here on your webinar and podcast. I should note that here in Stillwater, they still talk about the Tom Harris era. There's still quite a few stories making the rounds here in Ag Hall about when Tom made his presence known. So always honored to be a part of his work. As Tom said, I do quite a bit. I work in rural economic development, just like Tom does, and I do quite a bit of what impacts broadband can have for rural communities and rural economies. And so I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and let you guys see this presentation. It basically deals with a paper that we recently published and has actually been getting a pretty good bit of attention. So here's the paper itself. You can see up there at the top, and it's called State Broadband Policy, What Impacts Availability. So this was joint work with my colleague, Roberto Gallardo at Purdue. He couldn't be here today, but we're gonna talk through the basics of it, and I'll give you guys an overview. So as Tom said, going through this whole pandemic, it's certainly made how important broadband is widely known, and people have been recognizing that. It was recognized 2 or 3 years ago, and now it's at the top of everyone's mind. We do know that rural areas have continued to lag behind in terms of availability. I think that's particularly true there in Nevada. I think the rural parts of your state are some of the worst connected in the country. We also know from the existing literature that broadband is important for rural and urban economic outcomes. So there's a lot of good studies done there by people in ag econ and general economics departments. But what we also know is that states have taken widely different approaches to try to improve their broadband situation. So you can see here some of the bullet points we have. Some states have set up dedicated offices with full-time employees trying to address this broadband situation. Others have put into place state-level funding mechanisms, so they have dollars allocated from their state legislature every year to try to improve the situation. And some states restrict what type of entities can provide broadband. In particular, cities themselves building their own broadband networks is essentially outlawed in about 20 to 25 states, and that's kind of changed over time. So what we don't know is which of these policies works to improve broadband access, and that's kind of what we set out to do. So you can see here on the right of this slide, we got some examples of a state broadband office, and then some funding that's set aside in New York, and then Utah has some obstacles for municipal broadband. And we'll look at what states are doing generally as we get a little bit further along. So, kind of some previous research on this topic, really it hasn't been examined for more than a decade. Some early studies looked at a few state level policies like tax incentives and said that they're basically ineffective at promoting availability. Another early study said that, if we try to focus on increasing demand, that might actually be the best way to go about it. And so really the existing literature doesn't talk about how effective these different policies are. We kind of saw an area there we could go and try to make some hopefully useful research. And the reason why we haven't seen any studies before this is because it's not easy to go in and pull out all this data on state level policies. And so thankfully we didn't have to do that. And I'll talk about who did here in a second, but this has only recently become available, all these different state level broadband policies that are in place. And so we jumped on it when we found out it was going to did some analysis. So the research questions where we tried to answer with this work is, do these state level broadband policies impact overall availability? And in particular, we wanted to focus on rural availability because we know that lags behind. And as I kind of said, we've got these 3 specific broadband policies that we are focusing on, at least at this point. We've already started some work on some other policies, but these are the ones we evaluated in this work. Like I said, the existence of some kind of a state level office with full-time employees, the existence of a state level funding mechanism for broadband, and the existence of state level restrictions on cooperative or municipal broadband provision. So I'll just give you an example here in Oklahoma. We have people that work in broadband, but there is no official state office with a full-time employee. So we have a state broadband coordinator, but that's not her full-time job. She does 3 other things in addition to that. So that's an example of, we would get a 0. We would not have a state level broadband office. We don't have a state level funding mechanism, and we do not have any restrictions either. So we would get 0s across the board on all these. We'll look at some of the other states in your all's region here in a second. So what we tried to do was we built a kind of a big panel data set, which means we followed the same counties across a time period. So we followed all 3,140 counties, and we built this data between 2012 and 2018, which is the latest we had available. And so what we had 3 different kind of outcome variables that we're interested in. Most of them deal with the percentage of the population in that county that has access to the official measure for broadband, which is this 25/3 measure up here, 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload. That's what the FCC defines as broadband. So that's one dependent variable. The other ones are the percent of the population with access to fiber, which is kind of like a future-proof version of broadband. It can provide speeds up to 1-2 gigabits per second. And then we had a percentage of the population that had access to at least 2 providers, so a measure of competition in there. And then, like I said, we also compiled rural-only versions of those variables by using the low-level census block definitions. So that was our outcome variables, and the things we were really interested in, these state policies. Did these state policies impact all these different outcome measures? And so we realized that there's other things that are probably going to affect broadband access, things like income levels, education levels, poverty rates, population density, even topography. And so we had all these different sources for those variables, and we put them into our model as well. So the idea is we want to estimate what impacts broadband availability, and after we control for all these things we think affect availability, then do the policies still have some kind of an impact? And so I mentioned this kind of summary of the data of all the state policies that are in place. This was compiled by the Pew Charitable Trusts about a year ago, in July of 2019. They had a couple people whose full-time job it was to go through and search through all the state level statutes, executive orders, governing directives, and for specific broadband related terms all the way back like the 1990s, and put together this nice little website and spreadsheet of that's a comprehensive collection of all the policies that are in place. Once we got our hands on that, we realized we had to ground truth it a little bit, because, for example, some statutes can actually establish a task force, but then not provide funding for any full-time employees, or set up a task force and then it becomes defunct, 2 or 3, 5 years later. So we didn't know what was actually in place during the years of our analysis. So we actually sent out emails to all 50 states And I got a decent response rate. About 62% of them responded, letting me know that the policies that we had in our database were either correct, or in a couple cases they said, no, they're not. You know, we actually did have a person in these years and didn't in these years. So that's kind of how we went about putting this data set together. And this is what it ultimately looks like. We've got this data set from, again, this goes back to 2010 through 2018 for all 50 states. And you can see the ones are where they had a policy in place. This is for broadband funds, if broadband funds available. So if you look at Iowa, for example, they did not have a funding program through 2014, but then they set one up in 2015. And alternatively, Illinois did have one in 12, 13, and 14, but not in the years after 2015. So we did this kind of policy data. We collected it for all 50 states for those three policies that I mentioned: the funding, the state broadband offices, and then the municipal restrictions. And so here's kind of the data, the outcome measures that we had. You can see that the broadband availability generally increased over time from about 32% up to about 79% over our years. And you can see there that's also true for fiber, from about 7.5% to 25%, and also for the competition measure. We also note that these policies did change quite a bit over the years. In the beginning of our analysis, only about 10% of counties had a state with some kind of funding, and that moved up to 33% by the end. So states are starting to implement this. You can also see the percentage with the state office increased pretty dramatically, and the percentage with municipal restrictions actually dropped. You can see there from 57 down to 52. So there's some states are actually taking this out, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So there are some states that have removed these municipal restrictions. We have to talk a little bit about the data, the broadband data, because it gets a lot of bad press. You can see here some of the headlines. You know, it fails to count X million people. Congress tells them to fix the maps. Some providers are giving false data, and there are widely recognized problems with this data set. The major one is that if even one household in a block gets service, then they say, the maps say all households in that block has service. And that's not necessarily true, especially for big counties and big blocks like you guys have there in Nevada. So that can potentially overstate how many people have availability in this data. Some other problems with it: they only show us the advertised speeds. We don't know the actual speeds. There is no cost data in this. And like I said, some providers have just flat out given incorrect data. Although, a lot of people say this is terrible data, we shouldn't be using it, but it's still pretty comprehensive. We make the argument that it's the best and most complete data we have. And so we have to try to do at least some kind of analysis with this data. And so we actually put a little bit in the paper about how our analysis might be affected if the data has either gotten better or worse over time. And so we talk about that a little bit. So here's kind of our measures of the outcome measures. You can see the broadband availability measures increasing over time, both for rural and for overall. And you can see there the level of competition and the level of fiber are also increasing slower at a slower rate. So just want to point out, these are what's in the main chart here is for county averages. So you can see there in the latest data, it says only about, almost 80%. So in the average county, it's just an 80% access rate. These are significantly lower than what the FCC report will tell you, and they'll tell you that it's 93, 94% of the population that has access to broadband. The reason for this is because these are county averages as opposed to population weighted averages. So if you have only 2 counties, and one urban county with 1 million people has 100% availability, and one rural county with 3,000 people has 0% availability, then the average of those is 50%. But the population weighted average would be much closer to 99%, right? So that's why we have these different numbers. We're looking at county averages as opposed to population weighted averages. So this is probably going to be of interest to you guys. What states have changed policies over the years? So you can see here that yes, Nevada actually did add a broadband office during this time frame. They did not have one in 2012, but they do as of 2018. You can see some other states, some other Western states were pretty progressive in adopting that as well. So about 10% to 50% of states took that approach. And here is the state broadband funding. Once again, Nevada pops up as being an adopter of funds. So they have a state level mechanism for funding broadband. You can see that also became more popular, although not quite to the extent that the state broadband office. And then lastly, we have these municipal broadband restrictions. And if you kind of look there, you can see, you can maybe pick out a couple states that did away with these. So Colorado did away with it over the years, and I think Tennessee did away with it over the years as well. So you can kind of see just a couple states removed those restrictions. Are still in place in quite a few, including there in Nevada. So here's some more descriptive statistics. You can see we have measures for things like population, income, population density. There's a topography measure on how steeply sloped your terrain is. And we also have some instrumental variables on here for things like how conservative your basic population is, and also your legislators in the state and House and Senate. And so we actually gathered some state level measures for that, thinking that could potentially affect what type of legislation gets passed. And so the idea here is that we've got these fancy equations, and I always say, kind of glaze over this if you're not a data nerd like me. And essentially what we do is we try to measure the outcome we're interested in is these broadband availability measures. So the percent of the population that has broadband, and we know that it's impacted by all these other variables, poverty rates, education, topography, et cetera. But then also the main variable of interest, which is these policy measures that we have. Okay? And so we do some fancy dynamic panel regression techniques and figure out if we get positive or negative impacts of our policies on these availability measures. And this is just kind of the name for it. It's called this GMM approach. It's been pretty popular in this field. So to get to the results, the first thing I want to point out is all the control variables have the direction and sign that we thought they would. So for an example, if you have a high percentage of highly educated people, that has a positive impact on availability. If you have a lot of people in poverty, that has a negative impact on availability. We also see that population density is positively related to it. So the model is behaving like we thought it would, okay? So going to the policy measures here, we kind of look at the ones that have all the stars on it. And because those are the policies that had the biggest impact. And the first one that really stands out is this municipal restrictions. It has a negative sign, and it's typically between 2 and 3 percentage points. So those states that had municipal restrictions in place, like Nevada, saw availability rates that were 2 to 3 percentage points lower than they could have otherwise expected. And so that policy had a negative impact on broadband availability. We can also see that for the state funding, you typically see a 1 to 2 percentage point increase in broadband availability for the states that had that in place. So that also had a positive impact. And then the state office didn't have impacts on the main measure of 25.3 or the fiber, but it did here for this competition measure. Okay, so there was some evidence of state effectiveness, state office effectiveness for that competition measure. And we also saw very similar things for just the rural portions of counties. Again, the results for the controls are all intuitive. The impacts here for just the rural parts, it's actually even slightly bigger for those municipal restrictions, from 2 to 4 percentage points for the main level of reduction. And then again, for the state funds, we see a 1 to 2 percentage point increase, and just a slight impact here for the state office. So, my colleague Roberto says, okay, let's just tell the story in 2 slides. So this is everything you need to know in 2 slides. The outcome measures here that we wanted to know were these access to 25.3 speeds, competition of 25.3 speeds, and then fiber. And here's all the things that we kind of poured into it. We looked at these policy variables that were the main things we tried to estimate. Other things we knew would affect broadband access, like income, population size, et cetera. And then also these kind of state level, how conservative is your state in terms of legislators and general population. So we have all these observations, we use all this data over here, and the results say that these municipal network restrictions really do serve to lower overall availability in pretty much all cases, and the state broadband funding has positive impacts on almost all cases as well. So these are the two kind of main takeaways. These two policies had very, very big and notable findings for the impact of broadband, on the impact of broadband availability, and the state office had smaller but still measurable impacts. So the conclusion here is that we can say state policies are having an impact, and in particular, those municipal restrictions are having a negative impact. So we would argue that if you are in a state where they're in place, you can use this hopefully to argue that they should be taken away. And we also can say that the funding programs and state broadband offices are having a positive impact. So we try to give an estimate of how big these impacts are. A typical county in 2018 has only about 71% of its rural population with access to broadband. And we say if they started a state level funding program and got rid of their municipal restrictions, they could bump that up to maybe 77%. So pretty sizable in terms of the policies that can be put into place and having an impact on these things. Some of our results have been taken to show that these state broadband offices aren't having a big impact. And we did, only show a positive impact for just a couple of outcomes. But we note in the report that, many states only started these a couple of years ago. So there was only 8, as of 2014, but it really bumped up to 25, just a couple of years later. And we kind of argue that the benefits of those offices can take a significant amount of time to build up. So if you think about some of the things they do, they work on planning and capacity building. They talk to all the providers in the state and try to figure out what's the best approach in different areas. And so that can take time. And we kind of argue that, there might be this interplay between those state offices and some other policies, including ones we didn't even examine here, that might be promising. And there's some actually research here. There's a nice Pew report that looks at some promising practices in some of these state offices. It gives some nice examples. And we also note that our data only went up through 2018. And so if you look at the most recent update that Pew did to this, we see states taking steps in this direction. So there's 4 more states that have set up their own task force or state office. Seven new states now have broadband funding structures that didn't just in 2018. So it's a big jump in 1 year. And then 5 states are going to reduce their restrictions that were in place. So we see steps in this direction, even without our academic work, which kind of says maybe they don't even need our reports to figure out what they're doing incorrectly or correctly. So this is kind of a slide I put in here for implications for what extension educators can take away from this. The first one is to be aware that state policies can impact broadband availability. I would argue that you should go in and use that state broadband policy tool to find out what's happening in your state. They've got a lot of good detail on there, not just on these 3 policies, but on some other ones as well. And then I think you can have an active role in sharing these research findings with your local contacts and people interested in broadband. I would not suggest you give them the actual study because, like I said, it's filled with equations and things that'll put people to sleep. But there are some popular press write-ups on this, and I've got some links here that you all can use. We've got a couple of versions of it that make the case more succinctly and minimize all those numbers and equations that are in there. And then the last thing I have here is to reach out to whatever state agencies you're aware of that are working in the broadband area, and really let them know, how extension can help. I mean, the strength of extension is we have people in every county in the state, and we know what's happening on the ground. Like I said, if some of these data are off for the FCC maps, you can speak to that in your county and tell them, hey, that map says we have 3 providers, but really we don't have any that reach 25.3. So that's kind of the benefit of extension, kind of ground truthing some of this work, but also reaching out to people interested in doing this kind of work and letting them know that this research is out there and potentially help them make a case for what they can do. So that's it. I don't know how much time I used up, but I think I might have been right on target.
Yeah, you really are, Brian. Right. Thank you. Thank you. Let me, I got one question from Marlene. Marlene, Marlene, could you ask Brian your question, please?
Yeah, well, thank you, Brian. That was great information. I enjoyed the presentation. I guess my question was, I've done a little work in broadband, and when I try to go to the FCC maps, I don't have any accurate data. I'm always told it's inaccurate and it's off. So the information you presented, I guess my question is, will this information be made available for people in other states and accessible so that, for example, if I'm working on a grant or something, I could go in and click on the different counties and I could pull all this data up? Is
Right.
that
So that's a really good question. So we don't have an online format like that. What I would say is that the paper itself does have it, so that it's not going to be, well, the data that we have in the paper shows what policies are in place for every state. And so that you can get that from the state broadband policy score from Pew. That's we hadn't thought about putting the actual county availability data and searchability data in an online format. Like we said, we did kind of gather that from the FCC map. So you probably could get very similar. You have to be careful with that map, because if you don't go in and change some of the parameters, like it counts satellite. So like everything shows up as having access because you have a satellite connection available to you. So you have to go in and modify some of those things to get a little bit more accurate of a picture. But that's something, and you're right, there's no easily up-to-date map that exists for counties. I know they're working on it. The newer version of the FCC data is supposed to be collected at a different level, so not using the census block anymore, but they're going to require them to submit shape files, which should hopefully demonstrate that this house has it, but this one across the street doesn't. But that remains to be seen. We don't know what that's actually going to look like when it gets here.
okay? Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? I have, but Bob, Dinah, or Holly, you have any questions before I ask mine?
I do not.
Okay. Go ahead, Holly or Dinah. Well, one thing I found kind of interesting always, I didn't see, you had a variable percent of houses built after 2010. Nevada has been one of the fastest growing states since 1980. In fact, I have out here in Verdi, there's some new, and it's interesting there on the news, young people won't just buy any house. That's what we call affordability. The affordable house has to be a smart house. Mm-hmm. And did that 2010 ever come up big and significant or not? Houses? Because that is going to put, to me, that's pushing, it does everything except comb your hair now. But
that was surprising to me, is how significant that was, especially for the fiber availability. It turns out that that's a really good predictor of how much fiber you have in the ground, is how recent your housing is.
Yes.
So like you said, if these houses are coming up after 2010, they're realizing this is probably a good time to lay infrastructure for fiber. And so it really was very highly significant. In fact, it was one of the biggest numbers that we saw on the coefficient. So that's a good question, and it absolutely was.
I think, Ryan, it's like when I was in Ely, Nevada, which is a mining town with very poor internet, and I always tell this story where the mayor was, they have a state prison, which is supposed to be an economic generator, and they were having trouble keeping prison guards, and she said they can't game, and I was pointing to the Nevada hotel, they can go play 21, and went, no, you're wrong, they can't download their Netflix, those other things. And so it was our news really was showing that you just young people don't buy a house anymore. It's got to have a smart house, and how much of demand were those, and they sell at a premium. And so you're right, they are driving the needs of people, not only for business, but also for quality of life, that kind of stuff. That's interesting. I like that. Yeah, I'm glad you showed it. In 2015, Nevada started a policy, and we were just started on that. Could you talk a little bit, Mark, what are municipal restrictions?
Yeah, so I didn't make that very clear, and I apologize. So really, there's a lot of states out there that are saying, if you have a city that wants to set up its own broadband network and lay its own fiber and run its own kind of really business to sell internet to people, that some states say you cannot do that. The idea here is that a lot of times that infrastructure would be funded by taxpayers, so they would take out bonds and run lines in the city, and the providers say that's not fair for you all to have state subsidized infrastructure that competes with us. And so that's why a lot of states have outlawed it. And like you said, there's still about 25 states that don't have this, that have some kind of restrictions in place that basically say it is illegal for a city to set up its own broadband network and pay for it with taxpayer funding, and then sell that service essentially to compete with what might be a provider. Now, a lot of small cities that have looked into this, the reason they're doing it is because there is no provider in their area. And so that, that sometimes that argument might fall flat, but usually the big name ISPs, AT&T and Verizon and those guys are going to say, it's not fair. If we wanted to come into that market afterwards and compete, then we have to, compete against this subsidized broadband network, and it's not fair to us as private providers.
And your deal on competitors, you get two firms, I guess, are competing. State agencies are more effective with that because they're.
It could be. We just looked at any type of competition between broadband providers. So, I think the numbers are pretty high in terms of how many just have one available to them. So if you only have one broadband provider, you're not, you can't really do any bargaining and try to get a good price and that kind of stuff. I think it's something like 60 to 70% of areas only have a single broadband provider. So, you could say that, a municipal broadband network could come in and compete with that existing provider. But again, they would raise a fuss about that, saying it's not fair for, we built our infrastructure on our own dime, and now you guys are, the taxpayers paying for this other version. So they would argue it's not fair.
In rural areas, are a lot of the electric co-ops joining this stuff?
That's a huge step we're seeing in just the past really 2 or 3 years. 4 or 5 years ago, we were not seeing the electric cooperatives jump on it. Now we really are. They're becoming a much larger player. There is some funding available here for electric cooperatives from USDA, from the FCC, and we're seeing a lot more awards go to them. And they typically lay very fiber networks, like really good quality networks, whereas some of the private providers are not necessarily laying that elite level infrastructure. But the cooperatives have really jumped on this. In fact, here in Oklahoma, in my local rural cooperative just announced that they're going to start a 5-year build out for fiber to the home. And we have in some of our counties in mine, Payne has a pretty decent connectivity already, but some of the other rural ones do not. So it's definitely something we're seeing more and more of.
And I remember we were talking, I remember Sam Cordes was talking about, in 1930s, the rural electrification. USDA rural development's kind of stepped in that. They've been doing a lot more of investing, haven't they?
Yes. So that's actually probably the biggest sources of funds for this is the USDA has they used to call them Community Connect broadband loans. And so they still have this kind of broadband grants and loans program. This Reconnect program has been huge in the past couple of years. It was actually part of, they did some of this with the CARES funding as well. So there's, it's been close to $1 billion that's been distributed over the past couple of years in these Reconnect grants. And they do have kind of a formula for who gets the money. And you have to show that right now you don't have any availability. You have to show your income levels and how rural you are and things like that. And they try to, do the calculation on how many homes are going to be served. And so there's a lot of analysis that's going on to see what counties can get this. But I think they've made, here in just 2020, I think they've already made maybe 30 or 40 awards. It's maybe a couple per state at the most, so it's not a ton. But in 2019, they made quite a few as well.
Right.
So there is some money going in this direction.
The interesting thing is also how these hotspots when people are going to school. I know in Iowa they put hotspots or something in the school buses where kids could drive up and get in, and even some of our cooperative extension offices have been hotspots, haven't they? Some intended ways for rural areas.
Like I said, COVID-19 has really pushed this into the forefront, and schools were really struggling to figure out what they were going to do. Let me get something here to show you guys.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've seen these things or not. This is actually a little hotspot. It looks just like a cell phone. Here's my phone.
Yeah.
But this is a hotspot. And what a lot of schools have gone and done is just handed these out to students. And this thing works off a cellular network, just like a cell phone. So you can drive down the road in this thing and put it in your home. Anywhere there's a cell signal, it should use that signal and then shoot it to all the devices that you have in your home. And so a lot of school districts got their hands on these. They're hard to get nowadays because there's so many that have been distributed for this. And they were giving them to all students. They could take it in their house. Again, it is dependent on having a cellular signal, but data from the FCC says that's pretty wide. It's like 99.9% of households have some kind of cell signal. So, the issue with this is you got to have a device to do something with it, right? And if you've got a kid trying to do homework on a smartphone, it's not always the best option. So we're kind of seeing a combination of this plus, Chromebooks or other things like that, trying to address the connectivity issue.
Good. It's also, Marlene, I bring up her case. Her husband, because of COVID, her and her husband work at home. She had 2 daughters to go to school. There's some households got 4 people on a laptop at the same time. That's a unique. What is any data like? You can get the how many houses are connected, but I hate to say it, how many water faucets are going on at the same time each house? Is any kind of information? Or what does that cause problems in the households? I mean, even think of rurals. I could see your mother and father working, and all of a sudden the kiddo get on does that crash the system?
Yeah,
problem.
Let's see if I've got this report laying around here.
Okay.
There was a nice report that looked exactly at this issue. I don't think I have it laying around.
You can send it to us later, Brian.
The short answer is you can't dig into how many school-age children are in each household. You can look at, does this household have a computer or not? But you don't know if they need 3 computers to successfully navigate this system. But you're right. In my own household, I've got 3 kids, and so fortunately, when we kind of spread them out, we got one sitting in a closet because we don't want everybody else to listen to their school conversations and everything. So luckily we have enough devices to share, but that's not always the case. I know some districts are being good about trying to distribute the Chromebooks and things that they do have, but not all districts are able to do that. That report does a good job of kind of saying this is a limitation. We can estimate how many households don't have devices, but we can't say for sure how many total people, how many school children need devices.
Does that, if you had, Brian, okay, does that increase the price of it?
No, not necessarily. A price of what? Or are you talking about
the internet service? I mean, I think internet service prices have to be considered.
Well, that's a good point, because if you're on something like this, there is a data limit associated with this, and most people, have a limit every month that they have to pay for. And if you've got 4 kids downloading videos and doing Zoom calls and stuff like that, you're going to shoot through that, and yes, you absolutely will pay for data overages if that's the case. Now, on a more typical, wired connection like I'm on here at my desktop, and you have that in your home. If you have a wired connection, then there's typically not that data limit that you have to worry about, and so you typically, that's included in your monthly cost. But those wireless connections, like through the hotspot and through your phone, there is a data limit that can dramatically increase the cost in some cases.
So what happens when you're on the computer and all 3 of your kids are on the computer?
Well, that depends on your connection. How much speed you're paying for every month. One of these things can connect up to 10 devices at reasonable speed, so they can usually get about 10 megabits per second per device. It will slow down if there's 4 or 5 people on at once, but not measurably. Unless you're doing something fancy with it, which I think most school programs that are doing can typically get by with that, kind of 5 to 10 megabits per second. But yes, if you are on a more limited speed plan, and you've got 5 people using it for different things, you probably will see a decline.
I was going to say, your state extension comments, what do retail businesses and what does the business sector say about it?
There
difference in rural and urban.
There hasn't been as much research on the kind of business side of it. We do have some showing that businesses are more likely to locate where there's good broadband speed, as you would expect, but we don't really know kind of what speeds they need. Of course, their speed thresholds are higher, and they typically pay more for them. but there hasn't been as much done on the business side of things as there has for households.
Right. I do know some states, extension, larger ones, do have program in Minnesota how to use broadband in your business, how to properly advertise, Google, and there's little tricks of the trade. There's even a profession called internet interceptors or some kind of, I never heard of it, but people know how to use this thing to increase sales and use and costs.
I actually did those workshops for quite a few years when I first got here. I did kind of like how to set up a small business website, simple, helping small business owners set up a website, start taking PayPal payments. We did some of that search engine optimization stuff. And I finally got to the point where I had been just about to every county in the state doing it. We kind of stopped doing it after a while, but they're still popular,
Sure.
Especially for people that, they make a business doing that kind of stuff. They're really good at it.
Good. Okay. Any other questions from Holly or Diana?
Yeah, it's Holly. I've been wondering, we certainly see the rural areas, not only do they talk about lack of speed at times, but consistency of service seems to show up. You supposedly get whatever bandwidth, but no, people are saying, no, it drops away, we have problems. One thing that concerns me besides that is, how do we know where we should be going in the future with the increased uses and the demands? You were talking about smart homes. We're talking and hearing about people being able to do IT work from home. Does that leave rural areas or areas with poor service further and further behind to being the places you could live and would want to live? And are there measurements out there kind of identifying where we should be going to build out, not where we're at right now? I keep finding that what I've seen is only where we're at right now, and are we making that bare minimum of what's required for supposedly broadband service? But is that where we need to be, and how fast is that moving?
Yeah, some really good questions. So, the first one is about the sporadic connectivity. Unfortunately, there's no data about that. There are some data sources online that measure actual speeds, and so you can kind of see the minimum and maximum for your city and county, but it's not very easy to use at this point. So that's something that people kind of recognize, but we haven't seen a lot of research on. Your second point about the broadband speeds is something that is more widely recognized. People do think, this current threshold that we have of 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up, we've had it in place since 2015. And some people are saying it's time to move that up. Some people I've heard argue for, 100 down and 25 up, or, even 100 in both directions. And so I think you're right. It is going to need to be moved up as we start doing more and more with it. You start thinking about things like telehealth and, the remote work and shipping these large files that are required for some types of remote work. I think we are going to move in that direction. The good thing about fiber, and I mentioned that, the cooperatives are big at pushing out fiber, is it's like I said, it's kind of future-proof. It can handle all those speed upgrades in the future. The more traditional, coaxial cable that a lot of phone companies and cable companies even run cannot. They can max out at maybe 50, 100 megabits per second. And so if they're laying that right now, then that's a problem, because it's not going to be future-proof. It's not going to handle the necessary speeds in the next 5 or 10 years. I think the industry is kind of realizing this. The FCC is a little bit late in terms of saying we need to bump that threshold up, but I do think it'll come over the next few years, and that's going to kind of reset the threshold for what places have broadband versus don't, and then you've got a whole nother round of funding that potentially could go to help those places that are below that bar now. But that's a really good point, and you're absolutely right. Rural places without it, they're just going to be further and further behind.
Brian, Holly comes from, she's now one of our area directors. She comes from a town right behind me, Caliente. And I remember that was in your office. What was it, 2 megabytes you had one day?
Oh, man.
And then they built this beautiful bike area, mountain bike. But people from Vegas, that's why I say people come from urban Vegas, and they want a bike, they want to get that GoPro, and they want to send it out. I mean, people think, it goes way back in the 80s. I did something on tourism in Utah. And there's one place, until they got an ATM, it didn't go, because urban people want urban services. And to me, they have a beautiful mountain bike area, but that 2 megabytes is going to retard its growth because, but it was something I was there and I trying to send something there. It's true. I mean, there's always examples, people having an EKG being done in Ely and it drops off. Either the guy's dead or it dropped off. But it is what you're bringing up. It's almost like we need pictures now of what kind of, it's kind of like, are you on a 2-lane highway or an interstate, really? That's what
yeah. Yeah, you know, even we had a national broadband map or plan, national broadband plan put together in 2010. And, you know, the FCC at that time kind of laid out what the speeds were required for different things. They talked about, you know, home use and hospital use and all these different things. And so, you know, we're 10 years later than that now, and there's certainly different thresholds, but I haven't seen an updated version of what they say, you know, is going to be required going forward. I think undoubtedly we're going to move above this 25.3 threshold, but it remains to be seen when and where. You know, potentially if the you know, presidential office shifts, the FCC could shift as well, and we might see a little bit more of a progressive look there. So we'll see what the future holds.
Well, if anybody had any further questions, Brian, thank you very much. It's very informative because this is a topic. It seems easy, but it's got layers, like layers here, and to be done. I think I paid all my parking tickets in Oklahoma before I came here at Oklahoma State, so I think I'm in the clear. I maybe 1 or 2, but they're kind of like savings bonds. And the longer you mature, hold them, the greater they mature. But
we're building a new ag hall here, Tom. So we're
are you really?
Yeah, we're looking for donations if you want to contribute.
That's right. I do appreciate your time and very informative. And like I said, yeah, this will be recorded, and when Bob gets it out, we'll send it out to a lot of folks because I think this is going to build questions. Bobby, you can put, I don't know if on a separate sheet, you can put my email address if people have questions who are watching on recording. My email is harris@unr.edu. I have one of the most simplest because I guess I was one of the 5 people that had the first email when we had 10 teachers here at UNR. But anyway, I will let you go, and hope the Cowboys stay in first place. We'll see you later. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it.